Hi everyone, it's Jenna Callahan from the Powassan Area Family Health Team, as always. Welcome back and Happy New Year! Welcome to 2021. I really hope it's better than last year. Um, Today's topic is understanding anger, coping skills, and healthy thinking. I think that as we go into a new year, let's learn some skills, let's challenge some of our thoughts and understand our emotions a little bit better. So this is a little bit broader than the focus on COVID-19, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So anger in the pandemic, anger right now is a completely normal emotion to feel. There's a lot of uncertainties that make people feel quite hopeless. Um, Hopefully, the holiday season was able to alleviate some of those negative feelings. They may have also made them worse for some people, feeling so very isolated during the holidays and the continued restrictions that we're facing through public health and government. Um, so, anger, again, very normal in these scenarios. And I've talked to some of my clients, and what they've said to me is that they are frustrated and angry by just having to think so much more about everything. Don't forget your mask. Don't forget the 6 feet difference. Don't forget to, you know, go into restaurants and pay with cards. I mean, there's a million different scenarios that we just have to think through a lot more, um, given everybody's boundaries, right? So in response to that, some people have anger, and that's okay. What is anger? I'm glad you asked. Anger is this evolutionarily developed emotion that kind of puts our radar up, if you know what I mean. It's the thing that tells us that something's wrong. It triggers our stress response that I've talked about before in just getting our blood pumping, our muscles tensed up, we're on high alert, our senses are up, if we need to defend ourselves or if we're feeling like we're getting attacked. And everyone feels anger. We all express it differently, but we all feel it. Our expressions of anger can be very different by our influence. Gender has an influence, culture has an influence, even the way we communicate has a difference. And we'll talk about that in a second. So this is what we call the iceberg of anger. And really, essentially what this means is that above the surface, we have what we see, what's the iceberg, and usually that is anger. Anger is a very surface level emotion. It's very easy to feel anger. It's very easy to express anger. However, just like they say about icebergs, about 90% is under the surface, the stuff that we can't see. And those are the deeper feelings that are below anger. So feeling hurt or guilty or ashamed, feeling overwhelmed or scared, lonely. Those feelings could present themselves as anger. But really, it's important for us to dive down a little bit deeper into ourselves and reflect a little bit longer to understand what are we actually feeling? What's going on underneath? If we recognize our feelings a little bit easier, then we have the ability to change them or the ability to ease them in more appropriate ways than anger can sometimes provide. So sometimes soothing anger is very much a band-aid for those other feelings. So feelings of resentment, is that resentment going to go away? Potentially not. We have to be able to recognize that we're feeling that. Is anger okay? Yes, of course it is. I'm never going to tell someone to not feel angry. I think a complete scope of emotional expression and emotional feeling is so important. And it's really what it comes down to is the way we express it. If we make people feel threatened, or we express it inappropriately, that's when it becomes a problem. But It can also lead to really positive change for us to stand up for ourselves in times when we're maybe getting walked all over, or advocating on behalf of those we love. Those are really positive things. So anger can lead to great things, and it's really normal. So yeah, it's important. When anger can become a bad thing is when it becomes harmful. So when we are hurting others or ourselves, saying mean things, doing mean things, or judging others unfairly without even knowing kind of that is a situation that they're going through, or making assumptions unfairly, um, that's when anger can become harmful. And also, it never leads to us feeling better. This scenario can still be the same, and there was nothing productive that we did out of anger in this scenario. So that's when it becomes harmful. Is anger a problem for me? Well, if it's really frequent, if it's very intense. So when I'm saying intense, I'm thinking of people who say that they black out when they're angry, or if they completely lose control of themselves and they do really, really terrible things. If it lasts too long. So usually anger is like a really like hit of intense emotion, and then with time it gradually fades away. Our bodies just haven't adapted to prolonged anger because it takes a lot of energy. So if it's lasting upwards of like hours, throughout, like even throughout the day, that's too long. That's stress on the body. Again, is anger a problem? If it leads to aggression, yeah. If it becomes verbally or physically abusive to anybody or to ourselves, don't forget that, then it's a problem. And of course, if it impacts our functioning, if it's disrupting our ability to work or to have good, strong relationships, that's when anger can be a big problem. So this is when we have those negative reactions to anger. And usually there's 3 different types of people. Well, there's 4, but 3 look at anger not necessarily the healthiest, we'll say. So we have the bottle upper, the bottler. This is the one who shoves it right down deep inside and tries to forget about it, never expresses their emotion, never stands up for themselves, for their rights. So usually what happens is this type of person bottles up all of this anger, and just like a pop bottle that has been shaken, it explodes. It has this huge eruption, usually for something that doesn't really like make sense for that sort of reaction. Like your dog pooped on the floor and all of a sudden you're just like raging. That's what bottling up usually leads to, just some sort of eruption where we have a breakdown. And then with someone who ends up being quite passive, usually this is paired with a lot of shame, a lot of apologies if it's impacted anybody else, and reverting right back to very passive behavior. Number 2, getting defensive. We see this a lot in passive aggressive or aggressive people. So this is the like, well, what do you mean? Like, how dare you think that of me? Why would you even ask me that? So that type of person, it's just really unproductive. It's not bringing any sort of solution or end to this anger reaction. It actually fuels it quite a bit more. It's pumping themselves up again all over. And finally, we have the person who lashes out. This is the person who would identify as being more aggressive. This is the person who is like big and tough and their chest gets all pumped up and they're in your face. They could be the yellers, the strikers, and yeah, again, just so unproductive and not helpful and really disrespectful as well. So anger management has 3 main categories, really important. So the first is understanding anger for ourselves. It's different for everybody, like I said, and demonstrated earlier. For example, for me, I recognize my anger and I understand it in that my voice starts raising and I don't even realize that I'm doing it. And all of a sudden I'm yelling and someone has to tell me to stop yelling. It's not good. And I start pacing. Oh, and I get so hot and my cheeks flush. That's how I know I'm feeling really angry. And I recognize that within myself, particularly the pacing. If I know that I'm pacing, it's time to like excuse myself and collect myself a little bit. Step 2 is building skills to control our anger. So for me, that's leaving and using some coping skills, which is the next slide. For me, I exit. I leave the room because I know that nothing I'm going to say is going to be beneficial to me or to anybody. It might actually make the scenario worse. And often I'll go into the other room and start practicing some grounding techniques where I can just get control of my breathing and my heart rate. And start like brainstorming a little bit. And I work on controlling my thinking traps, which we'll talk about later, and think about bringing myself kind of back down because I get very up. And finally is problem solving. So being able to go back into that scenario and be able to really realistically work on whichever problem it is that's presented itself and be able to make solutions going forward so those feelings don't reoccur. That's kind of the whole point. So it really is like a point A to point B in the shortest amount of time from anger to solution. It's just getting us there. So understanding how our anger comes out and how it affects us, building abilities to control our anger, and working on problem solving. Those are the 3 mainstays. Coping skills, just like I talked about. Okay, so after I exit the room, for me personally, like I said, I need to be able to control my own anger, and say things that I don't mean isn't going to work for that. So I leave the room once I feel like I'm getting there, and I start this breathing technique. And I definitely recommend the 4-7-8 method for a lot of different things, not just anger, but also for anxiety. It's inhaling for 4 seconds, holding it for 7 seconds, and exhaling for 8 seconds. So what that's doing is, well, it's giving us something to think about. We're counting, and it's very repetitive and just easygoing. It's also slowing our breathing, slowing it right down, slowing the heart rate therefore, and then shutting off that stress response that is getting us so pumped up. So I recommend that wholeheartedly. I also recommend doing other sort of like really mundane activities, pointing out the colors in a room, pointing out objects in a room. There's another one that's really good, and I always mess up the order of these, but it's seeing 5 things or naming 5 things you can see, 4 things that you can feel, 3 things that you can hear, 2 things that you can taste, and 1 thing that you can smell, I believe. Like I said, I always mess up the order on that, but it's so helpful to just get our head off of whatever it is that's causing us to elevate, and bringing us back down to kind of like homeostasis, just balance. Exercise is another really good activity. If we're feeling so pumped up and so aggressive, or we have all this excess energy, exercise is a great way. It's basically doing exactly what your body wants you to do. It's going for a walk, doing some push-ups, I don't know, going to the gym if you need to, all of those things. And you get this huge, wonderful release of endorphins afterwards that's going to counteract those feelings that you had before. Really good coping mechanism. And then other things, of course, like just plain coping skills that can be put everywhere. Talking with friends, using humor, watching our favorite movie, and listening to our favorite songs. Those things are going to help us care for ourselves just in general, and get us out of our own heads sometimes, we can get very trapped. And then finally, of course, sleeping well and practicing healthy thinking. Those are just good practices in our day-to-day life to not only help us when we're feeling quite low, but also for maintenance, just to like maintain our own mental health. So what is healthy thinking? And I know that I've preached positive thinking so much within the last 2 videos, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's healthy thinking. Healthy thinking is really just balanced thoughts. So it's looking at the entire spread of information that we have before us, the positive, the negative, and the neutral. And it's back to balance, just like I've talked about in the first session when I went on that little bit of a rant about balance. But healthy thinking is all of it together, the positive, the negative, and neutral, not discounting any of them, but then hopefully being able to draw a better conclusion or go forward in decision making a little bit easier. Thinking traps. These can be, they can get us very stuck. And they can be what hinders us from having very balanced thoughts. They're normal. Of course, they're normal. Just like a lot of our emotions, they developed for a reason. And they're to protect us, especially if we're feeling quite vulnerable and our mental health isn't necessarily like where we love it to be. Like I said in the first video, none of our mental health is where we want it to be particularly. So we are quite vulnerable to thinking traps if we're not actively doing things for ourselves on a day-to-day basis to make us feel better. So it is exactly like what it says. It's a trap. Insert meme. It's a trap from Star Wars. Here's some examples of thinking traps. I won't go over every single one of them. I'll just use a couple quick examples. But you are more than free to pause the video, read them over, evaluate yourself a little bit on if you're guilty of any of these thinking traps, and then then press play again and we'll move on how to challenge them a little bit. But the ones that, like, let's say, for instance, that I've been guilty of in the past is very much that black or white thinking. Black, white, good, bad, yes, no, no options in between. And it can be a very stuck feeling where it's like, if I don't sleep and I study more, I'm gonna pass the test. If I do go to sleep now, I'm gonna fail. Black or white, right? Like there's no in between. The thought of waking up early and studying a little bit before the test didn't even cross my mind at the time. It was like, we're pulling an all-nighter, which didn't work out very well anyway. Another is the should or must statements. Oh, I hear this all the time of like, if I had done this, it would be different. I should have done this. Like, I have to do this in the future. And I think focusing so much on the past, which is out of our control, or the future, again, which is out of our control, can be really harmful and put us in a place where we're just, again, very stuck. It's a trap. Should have done this. Like, coulda, shoulda, woulda, coulda, right? We can't control that. All we can do is learn from those experiences and move forward, trying to be better and more wise humans. And another, of course, is overgeneralizing right up at the very top. It's always like, this always happens to me, or like, I never get picked first, or like, I'm always the one who trips and falls. It's just this like overgeneralization that is not necessarily grounded in reality. That's a little like trick. That's a little tip for how to address overgeneralizing in the future. Are all thinking traps bad? No, not necessarily. Not at all. Sometimes they are grounded in reality. For example, if you are always the one who trips and falls, and you've never seen any of your friends trip and fall, well then yeah, like it seems pretty realistic that it is always you who seems to be like embarrassing yourself in those scenarios. Sometimes they are quite realistic and they're grounded in evidence of our pasts. Sometimes we've had really bad pasts, which makes thinking traps quite realistic. And also, thinking traps can be kind of this identifier for us moving forward in the future, that if we start practicing our coping mechanisms, then if our thinking traps go away, it's almost an identifier of like, oh, it's working. Like the things I'm doing to take care of myself are helping me think a little more clearly without getting stuck into these spiraling events. how to stop thinking traps. This can be very tough for some people. It's so tough, especially for those who experience anxiety, depression. This is what this is. It's just different types of thinking traps, right? Um, it's like these parasitic thoughts. Anyways, um, really, what we're trying to do is trying to identify evidence. Where is the evidence in these scenarios? So asking ourselves questions, questions to kind of bring up evidence. What actually happened? What am I thinking? What am I feeling? What is the other person thinking or feeling? What were they trying to say to me? What am I trying to say? And asking ourselves what potential solutions of these situations may be. Being able to identify the thinking traps that we use, part of that is just awareness of what thinking traps are. So definitely keep up your research with those, but also gathering that awareness when it's happening, like, oh, I'm doing that thing again where I'm stuck. I'm stuck in this thinking trap. And if we know that we are stuck there, we can challenge it and we can stop them in their tracks and not give them that attention that they crave so much. And that's done by collecting evidence. And collecting evidence, I mean, really, we have to examine it. And another really good way of gathering evidence is what I call the double standard technique. So if I were to pull myself out of my own life and look in on it as a stranger or as a loved one, for example, would I be so dang judgmental on myself? um, and would I be lifting that person up, or would I be tearing that person down? And often pulling ourselves out of that situation can bring us back to reality a little bit more. Like that notion of black or white thinking that I talked about. If I fail that one test, does that mean I'm a failure? Would I call anybody else a failure, or would I lift them up? Of course I would lift them up. I would tell them, like, summer school, you'll have the next test. You might not fail the semester, right? There's tons of different things. And we're usually our harshest critic, 100%. This survey method is kind of like what I talked about before about chatting with friends and family. Sometimes it's hard for us to make decisions because we're too much in our own minds. We have to get the opinions of others, those supportive people that I talked about within the last session, the ones that we trust, the ones that we know are going to tell it to us straight. Those people, ask them what their thoughts are. And sometimes that can pull us out of our own funk. And then finally, conducting an experiment. So, for example, if you think that you're unlovable and your friends don't like you, or maybe you don't even have friends, I would challenge you to message some of those people in your life and ask if they wanted to hang out, or ask them how their day was and see if they respond. Because that, in and of itself, challenges your thought that you're unlovable and you have no friends. And I hope it works, or else, yeah, they're not worth your time. You need some better friends. Hit me up. And that's it. That is essentially how to address anger, thought traps, work on healthier thinking overall, and how to cope. So, yeah. Again, as always, if there's any questions at all, please submit them in the Survey Monkey that should be linked somewhere around this video. The next session that's going to come out on January 15th is going to be about eating well, exercise, and getting a good night's sleep. So again, not so much focusing on the pandemic and how it's harming us, but how we can like overcome the pandemic and live our best lives, essentially. Useful resources always are down below. Check out our website and our Facebook page for any updates of cool information. We have a bunch of workbooks that are attached to this now. So an antidepressant skills workbook, thinking guides from Anxiety BC, and two workbooks here, or handbooks, sorry. We have the Anxiety and Phobia workbook that you can find online, and the Burns handbook, which is the Feeling Good handbook. So check those things out if you find that you're guilty of any of those thinking traps that I talked about in the video. And I would very much look forward to our next session, and we'll talk soon. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day.